Hello, everyone. Pastor George here with today's Bible study recap. And today in Bible study, we looked at 1 Kings chapter 22, verses 1 through 40, the story of how Ahab dies. And I chose this story because even though it's not about the other kind of major character or consistent character for a lot of 1 Kings, Elijah, I think it does a really good job at getting at the distinction between king and prophet and kind of the roles that they were there. I talked about this on Sunday, and this is an important thing to know. This isn't just like a historical factoid, because as we continue to move forward, we are going to hit the books of the prophets, right? And so why are they important? That's kind of the big thing to think about as we're going through those books and kind of what's been set up for us as prophets in terms of seeing, oh, this is their role. And this is the role of the prophet that we see today. So we have the story of Ahab. Now, Ahab, for those of you who haven't gotten to this part yet, Ahab is a king of Israel, and he is not a good one. He's kind of the one that is considered the worst by a lot of people, right? You might be more familiar with the wife. His name's Jezebel. Like his wife's name is Jezebel, right? Which still survives as like an insult for women, right? To call a woman a Jezebel. And then you have Elijah, who's kind of the main prophet that's been fighting against their reign as they've been doing lots of bad stuff, right? And so Elijah has been particularly taking them to task for their worship of other gods, specifically Baal and Asherah, who are these Canaanite deities that have begun to be worshipped alongside of Yahweh. And what's happened is that they have built these temples and had all these other prophets of these gods in their court. And so Elijah challenges them. They go out. He defeats them. He kills the prophets of Baal, and then he flees. And he goes off and does other things, and the narrative continues forward. This section involves the death of Ahab, and actually how that comes through the words of another prophet, this guy named Micaiah. And you can see that the prophet is supposed to serve as a check on the king's power, a religious check. He doesn't have any power. It's not like a check and balance outside of religious authority and power, which is big, right? That is important. But that's kind of how one checks the power of kings in this period. And I mean, I would say up until today. But anyway, okay, so our narrative begins with telling us that the war between Syria and Israel has ended for 3 years. They've been in a truce. They've been fighting for a long time, and you'll see this throughout the end of kind of First Kings. They're fighting each other constantly, but it ended with Syria still controlling some of Israel's territory, and Ahab wants to get it back. So he gets Jehoshaphat, who's the king of Judah. Remember, that's the southern kingdom, who's up there visiting. He gets him to come with him and agree to go fight. But first, Jehoshaphat wants to know what the Lord has to say. And this actually shows his character, right? We're actually not really introduced to him and his reign until after this story. But he's a very faithful guy. And so he actually cares about what the Lord has to say. And so, of course, Ahab goes, sure, I'm happy to do that for you. And he gets these 400 prophets together to prophesy for him. And these are probably the prophets of Asherah from the earlier narrative who do not go to meet with Elijah and therefore aren't killed and therefore are still around. So they begin prophesying, right? And they say, that only good is going to happen. But there's like this idea that they're not really supposed to be doing this sort of thing. And one of the things that you can kind of see some pagan influences with the horns and stuff like that that's happening. And Jehoshaphat doesn't like this. He wants to have a prophet of the Lord be there, not just any random prophet, but a prophet of the Lord. And so there's this comedy to this. Ahab asks for Micaiah, who he doesn't like because, as he says, I hate him, for he never prophesies good concerning me, but evil. And so Micaiah comes, and Micaiah at first is mocking what the other prophets are doing. He's saying, oh yeah, you're going to totally win. But in actuality, right, he says, actually, the vision I have is that the Lord has sent a false spirit to lie in all of these people's mouth to lead you into destruction, right? That's paraphrasing, but that's what's happening. And the other prophets get mad at him for saying that. And then, of course, the king doesn't like this, and so he takes Micaiah and throws him into prison for speaking the truth, like calling King Ahab out, doing the thing that he, should. I mean, this is an interesting lesson in the sense of, like, the king only wants to hear good things about himself, as many people do. This one person is critiquing him, and he doesn't like that, right? He doesn't take the critique, even though it's rooted in worshiping the Lord. And so then they go out to fight, and they lose, right? Ahab dies. Ahab actually, you can see him kind of hedging his bets, trying to trick God, maybe. He's wearing a disguise, hoping it'll help him. Originally, everyone thinks Jehoshaphat is Ahab, so they go to try and kill him, but he shouts, and something about the shout gives him away as being from Judah, and so they leave him alone. And then they just, an arrow is fired randomly and hits Ahab, mortally wounds him. He's propped up on his chariot to kind of keep the men in good order, dies later, and then they lose the battle when it scatters, and all that is done, right? So Ahab dies, and that's the end of the story. But I find this so interesting, right? Because Ahab, in his constant rebellion to the Lord, has done all sorts of evil and bad practices. In his death, it's even fulfilled of an earlier prophecy of Elijah that talked about how dogs will lick up his blood, and it mentions that these prostitutes also wash themselves in it, this pagan practice. So you see, even in his death, there's like this encroachment that's happened in his kingdom. And so Ahab, right, it certainly stands as an example of what a king should not be biblically, right? He should not turn people away from the Lord. But the interesting thing about this is it shows the tension that's going to define a lot of the history and what we're going to read later, right? So when you get past the Psalms and Proverbs and all that stuff, you start hitting the prophets. And the prophets are going to be all taking place in this time period. And so you're going to see how God tries to check the heart of the people of Israel and of the kings who continually lead their people astray, and how here you see an example of a king who gets it, but doesn't listen anyway. He doesn't want to hear these words. And I think today that we see so many parallels with our political system, with other things, right, where we just don't want to admit the fallenness of so much of the world and so many of our problems, right? And that oftentimes we will denigrate the word of God in our minds above whatever suits us or suits our political ends. That's why these books of the Kings and Chronicles and these related texts with the prophets are so relevant. I mean, they're always relevant, but I feel like especially relevant today. So that's what we talked about. I hope you guys found that interesting, and I will see you tomorrow for an episode of The New Thing. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and peace out.